Hi, everyone. This is Sal from the Miller Business Center. Welcome to another edition of Business Bites Online. Today, we're doing something a little different. We have a presentation for you on using a podcast to market your small business. Now, I'm going to be chatting with you based on my experience in assisting in the creation of our own podcast here at the library. Now, we've been doing the Middle Country Public Library podcast for a little over 2 years now. And just recently, we started up the Miller Center's very own podcast centered on business. I'm also going to be talking about the technical side of things, from equipment to hosting services, and we will go over some best practices as well. What it will all come down to is that you can probably start a podcast right now today with what you already have at home. And if you plan things out, you can have a great way of marketing your business and maybe have a little fun doing it as well. So we were recently able to attend PodFest 2020, and this was our second year. So we came back with a lot of great information that I'm going to share with you. First, I'd like to go over some geeky statistics because we're all geeks here at the Miller. Well, I'm a geek here at the Miller Center, so I do like charts and data, and it's really meant to show you and to illustrate how podcasts are really taking off. Now, this is from one of our fabulous databases, Statista, and you can see here a positive trend in podcast listeners in the United States. And I mean, look at that projection, almost double the listeners from last year, 164 million by 2023. And frankly, since this whole lockdown thing has happened, I bet you these numbers need to be adjusted up. So we're all home now looking for things to do and things to watch, things to listen. So podcasts are really exploding right now. Here's the percentage of consumers who have ever listened to audio podcasts for the last 13 years, and you can see it's a 40% increase. A tiny bit over half of U.S. consumers surveyed listen to podcasts. Now, that's an indicator for you that your customers and your potential customers are listening to podcasts. Now, what are we listening to? Well, you can see here that entertainment and technology are big draws. Over 60 million households listen to music-related podcasts, and business podcasts are holding their own here as well. You can see over 50 million households have fans of business podcasts in 2018. Again, I think these numbers are all markedly higher now since we're through this pandemic. But take a look at this. You know, radio used to be the king of audio programming, whether it was from news or sports or commentary. But this chart shows that podcasts are taking the lead with plus 4% over AM, FM radio, and remarkably 23% over Sirius XM. I mean, that's really surprising to me. I think it's clear that podcasting is the big growth segment in media right now, and it will continue to be. So why don't you consider doing one yourself? But you know, before we talk about equipment and software and hosting and marketing and all those technical things, what is your idea? How are you going to market this? You just can't go in there and hit record and expect to be fabulous. We're not all Joe Rogan here, so we have to think about some things. So let's think about what your show is going to be about. In all likelihood, you're going to want to talk about what you do, how you do it, how your business works, how your listeners can benefit from what you can offer them, and maybe at the same time be entertaining and informative. So you need to define your subject and your scope. And I suggest you start simple. In a little while, I'll talk about how we started the library podcast, and that's exactly what we did. We started simple, and then we evolved into something more. So, I mean, you may also want to think about your format length and the tone of your podcast as well. So these are all things you need to think about right up front. So is this going to be an interview podcast? Is it going to be conversational? Is it just you giving out information? Is it a storytelling podcast? You also want to think, okay, how long is this going to be? Is it a weekly podcast, bi-weekly or monthly, educational? Is it going to be entertainment? And is the subject going to be long or short form? So short subject, short form perhaps would be like maybe a 5 to 10 minute, podcast once a week. Some podcasters out there do a 1 or 1.5 minute podcast once a day. Or is it going to be long form? So it's every other week, and you do maybe an hour and a half. So there's more involved. It's maybe like a series of podcasts for a very large story. So you got to think about all this stuff. And, you got to think, well, hey, what's the average commute time on Long Island? Most people are going to listen to this in their car. I mean, can you guess what the average commute time is going to be on Long Island? You might be shocked and surprised. It's actually gone up 4% in the last year. It's 35.4 minutes. That's pretty wild that folks spend all that time in the car. So what are they going to do spending time in the car? They're going to be listening to something on their radio, listening to something on their phones. That's where you would come in with your podcast. And I also think it's very important that we talk about audience. And I want to take a moment to pause here from the presentation to just talk about something that I brought back from Podfest this year, and it has to do with your audience. So I went to a lot of presentations, a lot of panel discussions, and they all said the same thing. Your goal is not to get thousands of listeners. The goal is not to get thousands of downloads. The goal is to connect with listeners who are going to matter to you and to matter to your business. So not the quality of downloads, not the quantity of downloads, but the quality of the downloads and the quality of the consumer downloading your podcast. So, we don't have to be Joe Rogan. We're all not going to be Joe Rogan. He's got millions of people downloading his podcast. He's the biggest in the world. What we need is to have an audience that matters. And I'll be honest, we at the Middle Country Public Library podcast, we only have 30 to 50 regular downloads every week for that podcast. And it's perfectly fine for us. You know why? Because those are 30 to 50 patrons who are interested in our services and listen to us because they want to learn more about the library and they want to connect with myself and my co-hosts. It's a very personal, important connection that they have. That's what you need to do. You need to connect with listeners who are your clients, your potential customers, and the people who relate to what you're talking about. Those are the people who you want to convert into customers. Can you imagine if you had 30 to 50 people come into your store or meet with you on a regular weekly basis, like once a week, you have 30 to 50 people, the same people come into your store or use your service, and they're using your service, they're buying a product. That's your goal. Okay. And listen, if you get thousands of downloads and listeners for every podcast, that's fantastic. We'll have you on the show here at the library. You can talk about your success, and we'd love to do that. But for your goals, just to get started, you should start with quality over quantity. Okay. So that's my thing on audience, just to kind of step away for a moment. And finally here, marketing. How will you market your podcast? How will you turn that marketing that you do for your podcast into marketing for your business? So let's talk about equipment. And one of the things I love doing is talking about the tech side of things. And to be clear, you don't need thousands of dollars worth of equipment to do a podcast. Absolutely not. In fact, with everything that's going on right now, many podcasters are using the Zoom platform or Skype or Google Hangouts to do their podcast remotely, and it's actually working out great. But I don't want to get ahead of myself here. So let's talk about the basics. So you're going to need a microphone. I suggest if you're going to spend money on anything, spend it on a decent microphone. Now, I've got myself a nice kit here. I went to Amazon and I got myself a USB box, and that's a box that plugs into my computer via USB. And then I have a plug on the front where I plug my microphone in. It came with headphones, came with a boom mic, a pop filter, and I also picked a nice cardioid mic. It's the Audio-Technica 2020. It's a very nice sounding microphone. I'm using it right now for this presentation. And I got all of this for about $200. So not terribly expensive and more than enough to do what I'm doing from home. And a little later, we'll see that what we use for the library podcast when we're still in the building is much different. So we're going to show you a picture of what we use at the library when we reopen, what we'll be using. So these are the different types of microphones here on the screen. You have cardioid, omnidirectional, dynamic, condenser, and then the type of adapters, the type of connection you make, an XLR or USB. You really don't have to know too much about this except what the mic does. So, basically these are all named after the different ways that the microphone picks up sound. So if you have an omnidirectional mic, it's going to pick up sound around the entire area that the mic is sitting at. So if you have like a round table and you have 4, 5, 6 people at the table, you want all of them to be able to be on mic. You put the microphone in the center, and then everybody at the table is getting recorded. You have a bidirectional mic, you put it again at the center of a table, and just the people across from the mic in that zone there, zone number 2, mic number 2 here, only the people on either side there are going to be picked up. That's great if you're going to do a interview between you and someone else. And finally, the cardioid mic, which is I have a number of cardioid mics. It's just the front end of the microphone and some of the sides as well. And you could see the reason why it's called cardioid is it's shaped like a heart, and cardio. And don't forget headphones, especially when you're doing remote recordings. These are going to come in very handy. And when we talk about remote recording, a lot of remote recording is done, by Zoom and Squadcast and Skype and whatnot. And if the person on the other side of the recording does not have a does not have a headphone, what tends to happen is there's some feedback and some echo, and you definitely don't want that. You don't have to go crazy. You don't have to buy the Jabras, fancy Jabra mic, headphones. You don't have to buy AirPod Pros or anything like that. Just get yourself a nice, decent pair of headphones that are going to be comfortable for you to use, and you're pretty much good to go. So we have the mic and we have our headphones. So now we need to record, and in order to record, we need a computer and some sort of software. So this is usually referred to as DAWs, or digital audio workstations. And the best thing is that you don't necessarily have to pay for one. If you're on the Windows platform, I suggest Audacity. And if you have a Mac, you probably already have GarageBand installed. They both work very, very well. They're both free. They don't do certain things that perhaps a professional podcaster would want them to do. Those folks are probably going to want to use, Audition, Logic Pro, or Hindenburg, or TwisterWave, or one of those pieces of software. Personally, here at the library, we use Hindenburg. The reason why we use it is when we were at PodFest last year, we were able to meet the vice president of the company. He gave us a little bit of a sales pitch, to be honest, but after demonstrating the software, I personally got very interested in the software, so I actually sat in. He invited me to sit in on an all-day workshop. So we did the workshop for 6 hours. We're in there going over the software, and it really is a fabulous piece of software. It's very easy to use, and we like it very much. It makes my life as the editor of the podcast much easier. It sort of has like an AI, like an artificial intelligence. It knows where you want to be and where you want to go, what you want to cut, what you want to put together. It also has broadcast quality processing on it. So if you have some extra money, it's about $110 a year. It's a license that you pay. I would highly recommend it. You do not need it by any stretch of the imagination. You can get away, like I said, using these perfectly good free pieces of software, which is Audacity and GarageBand. They're not as turnkey, especially Audacity is not as turnkey. There's a little bit of a learning curve, but all the stuff on the screen here, you can do your due diligence, do some research on it, and see which digital audio workstation or which recording software is going to work for you. Now, as far as remote recording, well, we're all in the middle of remote recording right now, the remote recording revolution. So you can use Skype, Zoom, FaceTime. These are all readily available. They're all free. Zoom specifically is one that I've used before. That's fairly easy. When you record a Zoom meeting at the end, it converts, and one of those files that you're sent 4 files. One of the files that you're sent is the audio only file. So if you want to do an interview between 1, 2, 3 people, you can have them all recorded on the Zoom. And then from the Zoom recording, you take that file and you upload it to your podcast host, and there you go, you're all set. You can even drop that into Audacity or GarageBand or Audition or any of your software packages and clean it up if you like and edit it. One caveat, though, to using Zoom as compared to a piece of software like Squadcast or CleanFeed, Zoom is a single file, it's a single track. So if someone's dog is barking in the background, that's going to be picked up on Zoom. There's no way to edit that out if someone else is talking at the same time that the dog is barking. Whereas Squadcast and CleanFeed, they do multiple tracks. So me as the host, I have a track, and each of my guests have a track. Squadcast is a service. It's a app service. It's on the web, and it's a service that you pay for on a monthly basis. Again, I think it's about $10 a month for the service, but everything is backed up to the cloud. So God forbid you have a computer crash and you've just interviewed the county executive and now you're wondering, oh, do I have the file? Don't worry about it. It's still there up in the cloud. You can download it. And it really does come in very handy when we are recording remotely, to be able to edit each individual track and, work on the audio for each track. And like I said, maybe take the dog out. You wouldn't even know the dog was barking because we just muted the dog, and then when it's time for that person to speak again, she's back. So that's remote recording. And again, I highly recommend taking a look at each of these services and see which one works best for you. So let's talk about hosting, because some of you who may not know, when you go to grab your podcast, when you download your podcast, you aren't actually downloading it directly from Apple or Google or Spotify or Stitcher. Those are all directories, the distribution points, so to speak. So, you need to park your podcast somewhere, and that's where a hosting company comes in. Now, we here at the library use Podbean, and it's pretty inexpensive. It's the first one here on the left-hand side. We pay, I think, about $9 a month for the service if you pay for the whole year, so it's pretty affordable. It does the job. And look, I don't want to say that it's vanilla when it comes to features. It is fairly simple, and I don't think they're going to give you the same level and depth of statistics and analytics as you would like with, for example, with Blueberry. But Blueberry's more expensive. So I guess you get what you pay for in that respect. But if you're just looking for basic statistics, like how many downloads, where the downloads are, and what type of device was used for the download, Podbean is great for the price. Blueberry is going to give you much, much more data and much more granular information for your download information. Again, research each of these, see which one works in your budget, which one works for you. And if you're a tech company or a techie person, and perhaps you have your own web server, you can always self-host on your site. But then a couple things you want to think about. You would need to know how to handle an RSS feed and edit XML file. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, RSS feed and XML file, then you're better off going with a hosting service. And also, obviously, if your podcast hopefully gets big, traffic and downloads of your podcast is going to count towards your server traffic. So Podbean was pretty much turnkey for us. The setup is pretty easy. They walk you through the process fairly well. Now, it's going to be up to you after you get your host, it's going to be up to you to get your podcast listed on the various directories. So you'll have to go to Apple and Google and TuneIn and iHeart and all these places, fill out the application to submit your podcast. And after that, it's pretty quick. Some podcast providers and directories are like within a day or two, another take a week or two. Apple generally, if you're submitting a podcast, lately has been about a week. Google's pretty fast. TuneIn's pretty fast. Spotify is very, very fast. So it's amazing. After you submit your podcast to some of these bigger podcast providers, you'll start to pop up on the smaller services. So you'll see, you'll start to see your podcast show up, like on Blueberry and Himalaya, who have their own directories, and you won't have to do anything. So one more chart here for you data geeks out there. Again, this is from Statista. These are the top podcast providers. This was March 2019, and you could see Apple Podcasts is at the top. Spotify and Google Podcasts pretty much even underneath it. and then iHeartRadio. So look, most people are going to Apple, Spotify, and Google. That's where most people are going to go. And of course, Apple and Google has kind of that built-in application, easy to get to situation happening because a lot of times they're really pushing those apps on their app stores. So when you buy a device, it's like one of the essential apps that they push. So other things you need to think about before you do your podcast is your commitment. It's not just money, it's time. So a podcast does take time to make. It's not just the recording time. It's the post-production time. It's the pre-production. We're going to talk about that in the next slide, things that you have to do to prepare. So you're definitely going to want to think about that. You should be committed to your podcast. And, we highly recommend if you're going to do a podcast to do it at least once a month. I would say that's the bare minimum. I would feel more comfortable telling you to do it at least bi-weekly and do it twice a month. So time, very important. And again, money. Are you going to spend the extra money on a fancier piece of equipment? Are you going to spend the money on the fancier hosting? Are you going to go simple? So that's all something you have to think about. Your logo and your branding is also something that you want to think about. Logos are very important in the podcast world because a lot of these podcast directories are going to show similar podcasts on one page. And if your logo stands out and if it's designed properly, then you have the potential of someone clicking on there and maybe reading the description and maybe listening to one of your episodes. So you want to think about that. You also want to think about, do you want your podcast branding to match your business's branding, or do you want it to be complementary, or do you want it to be something completely different? So these are all things that you need to think about. Music licensing is up here on this slide. At the library, we have royalty. We used a royalty-free Creative Commons license for our music. We took a snippet of a song for our theme music. For the Miller Business Center podcast, I actually write the theme music. I put together the theme music and I write some of the incidental music. And that's all completely, royalty-free loops that I use in GarageBand. There are sites out there that will sell you the license to royalty-free music. Pay one fee and then you get to use it on your podcast. So it's something to think about if you do want to have music, or if you have a musician friend that wants to get the word out on what they do, have them write your theme song, have them write your exit song, and mention them in the podcast. That's a nice way of getting a nice barter there of getting some music. And fair use is what we do here at the library. We're an educational institution, for the lack of a better term. For educational purposes, we use the fair use concept, which is we'll play like 30 seconds of a song or a minute of a movie because we're discussing it in an educational way. We're not making any money off of anything, so we're pretty good in that respect. For you, if you're doing something with your podcast and you're going to be making money off of your podcast, if you're going to get advertisers, which is a whole other ball game that we're talking about. This is just a basic podcasting presentation, but if you want to monetize your podcast, then you got to think about what you're going to be doing with that quote unquote fair use audio or video if you're doing a video podcast. And that brings me to legal considerations. We're not lawyers here at the center. I'm not a lawyer. If you have a legal question about your podcast, maybe you have someone on who you're interviewing and maybe you want to use the material that you got from them a year from now, is that okay? Are they going to legally allow you to do that? Should you sign a contract? That's all stuff that you need to ask a lawyer. I'll tell you that in most likely, likelihood, it's not really much of an issue. But again, if you're going to be making money off of your podcast, or if you're going to be selling something, it's always good to make sure that you are in line with all the legal situations there. So here's an example. So let's say we want to do a podcast. You want to do a podcast about your business. The first thing I highly recommend doing is write an episode outline. This is what the introduction is going to be. This is what the first segment's going to be, the second segment, the wrap up. This is what is happening in the podcast. So this way you have a nice structure, and it will definitely cut down on your post-production time. I highly recommend having an episode outline so you understand what you're going to talk about and what your goals are. Which brings me to number 2 here. Write any copy that is important to you and your audience. If you are selling a product or a service, if you have a vitamin business or a herbal supplement business, and you're specifically doing a podcast about healthy lifestyles, and you want to push this one supplement that you make, you want to make sure it's in your copy before you even hit record. You want to make sure by the end of that podcast that you've mentioned it, because believe me, you start to talk, that record light goes on, you start to talk, you can completely forget that that's why we were here in the first place, was you to market your business and to sell your product. So write any copy that is important to you and to your audience. You want to schedule your time appropriately for recording and editing. So my kind of formula that I've come up with, this is based on my experience, is that for the time that you record, it's double the time to edit. So if I record a 20-minute episode, it's going to be about 40 minutes to edit that episode. And the reason being is that if you're really going to edit it for time, for the ums and the knows, and I'm a big guy with the I'd say a lot when I'm trying to think about what I want to say. So when you're editing those things and you're adding the music and you're making sure all those awkward pauses are taken out, that takes time. It's not just simple to do unless you get a really, really expensive piece of software. So I highly recommend that you consider whatever your recording time is, double that time for your editing. So if you have a 30-minute podcast, you're probably going to spend a total of an hour between just the recording and the post-production editing part of it, not counting your episode outline writing and all your writing for the script and the copying and whatnot. And if you have guests, be upfront with what will be discussed. It's every guest that we've had on our podcast, we've given them the questions ahead of time. Let your guests know the questions ahead of time. It'll make for such a better podcast, and you'll have a much easier time editing this podcast if there's less thinking. And this isn't Maury Povich. This isn't a gotcha interview. They're there to help you perhaps market your business, and you're there to help them perhaps market their business or their service, or maybe they're a customer of yours and you want to interview them on how well you did as a service provider. Give them all that information up front. Make them comfortable and explain the process ahead of time. So, you call them up ahead of time and say, hey, listen, if you're recording remotely, for example, say, listen, I'm going to send you a link to a website. You're going to click on that link and it's going to bring you to this website. You're going to log in. Please make sure that you have a good microphone. Make sure that your headphones are working properly. And, perhaps if you're dealing with something remotely, you might want to say, look, do you have high-speed internet? Because that's going to be very helpful. Have a backup plan. Say, hey, listen, if your internet is down, can I call you on your cell phone and we can do a telephone interview? So explain that process ahead of time. Make them comfortable so this way you have a good recording session with them. So make sure their equipment is up to date, working, and compatible with everything that you're doing on your podcast. And they are your first advertisers. So make sure they let people know that they are on your show. So if you have someone on your show, they should be telling all their friends that they're on your show. And all those friends will hopefully go to your show and download the episode and listen and perhaps subscribe if they like what you've said. And a lot of times that conversion rate, it's pretty high. People listen to one episode. If they like it, they subscribe right there and then. So that is a good situation that you want to be in. And I'll tell you from our experience here at the library, whenever we have someone on the show, an interview, we double our downloads. We go from like 30 to 60, no problem that week. So you definitely want to make sure that the people who are coming on your show are advertising the fact that they're on your show, be it word of mouth networking or social networking. So let's talk about some best practices. You want to know your equipment. You want to make sure you know your microphone. Every microphone is different. Speak into your microphone the proper way. A lot of microphones nowadays actually have an arrow to show you where you should be speaking, especially if you get a cardioid microphone. There's only one direction, or unidirectional microphone. So definitely know that. Consider using a boom stand or a headset. the headset is the microphone attached to your headphones. So consider using that. Make sure you're comfortable with all of your recording software. So this way, as you are moving forward in your podcast, it's less about the technical issues and it's more about the content. It's less about, worrying about getting a good audio sound out of it and more about, getting a good interview or saying something that people want to hear that's going to be helpful to your business. And recording location is incredibly important. I have location here. If you don't have a recording studio, and the majority of us don't, you want to find a quiet spot with little or no ambient sound. Again, I'm thinking about post-production here, folks. I'm thinking about making your lives easier. If you have, the ice cream man coming down the block, which happened last week for us recording our podcast, you're going to hear it on the audio. So try to be somewhere where it's nice and quiet, and also avoid items that could cause sound issues. So unfortunately, I've banged my mic a couple of times during this presentation. You might have heard it, but get a boom stand so this way you don't have to touch the microphone. Papers that rustle, they usually come up. They don't sound very good. Banging on the table, if you're really excited, if the mic is attached to the same table, that's a mess. You don't want to do that. Squeaky chairs, all that kind of stuff. So avoid those items so they don't cause sound issues. And also, if you're doing an interview and you have questions, I highly recommend either using a tablet to ask those questions, like an actual iPad or Android tablet, Samsung tablet, because when you move through the questions, you're not really making any noise. Or if you do print out your questions, just put them all either on one piece of paper, one-sided, or spread them out in front of you where you don't have to touch them. So everything is right in front of you. It really comes in handy. And show prep is important. The more you're prepared, the less ums or knows or those awkward silences. I just said it now. I said, awkward silences, and I banged my microphone. So I'm not doing the best practices here. So definitely be prepared. If you have to, write a script and follow the script as best as possible, and write an outline, follow the outline as best as possible. So this way you're not stumbling while you're recording. And I do want to mention I am a very good remover of ums. I've become an expert at removing. So the Middle Country Public Library Podcast, just an example. It's a weekly podcast, and this is kind of our tagline, meant to educate and entertain listeners with all the wonderful things we have to offer here at the Middle Country Public Library. And again, I use that as the tagline at the beginning because I wanted to do something. I wanted the tagline to kind of explain what we as the podcast creators wanted to do, which was we wanted to educate and entertain. You don't just want people to come in and hear it and it's boring and so I got information about what's happening at the library, but I probably could have gone to the website and just read that. We want to be entertaining. We want people to come back and hear, how funny we are, hopefully quote unquote funny we are. And on this podcast and also on the Miller Center podcast, we have a great rapport between each other. So when someone comes and listens to us, they're all going to attach to the person that they agree with the most. So for example, on the Miller Center podcast, we had a book discussion on the Energy Bus, and Alex and Elizabeth loved it, and I really didn't like it. So there was a little bit of a heated discussion. And if you're a listener and you liked the Energy Bus, then you can connect with Alex and Elizabeth. And if you didn't, you can connect with me, and maybe you'll come back next week to see if you agree on something else, so on and so forth. That is building your audience, not just by numbers, but by content and by connections. So it's important to think about your show as infotainment, or edutainment is a good way of looking at it. So it is co-hosted. We have two of my other wonderful, fabulous colleagues, Sarah Fade and Nicole Rambo, and myself host this show. It's very conversational. It's very easygoing. We do not have a script. You can hear that when you listen to us. It's very off the cuff, which is the way we want it to. We have segments, and the average show length is 23 minutes. We wanted to make the library podcast short. We wanted people to listen to it in the car, on the way to work, on the way home. So we post episodes every week or weekly, and it's every Thursday we post episodes. And it started out simple. We worked our way up to more sophisticated equipment. So really the whole first year we were using just literally equipment that was lying around the library. We found some old DJ mics and an old mixing board that was being used for programming. So we set that up, and we didn't even have boom mics. It was just kind of like sitting on the table. We plugged it into a computer. We used Audacity, and we did that for a whole year. And if you listen to episodes 1 through 52, or actually it was 1 through 60 maybe, of the podcast, you will hear the difference in audio quality. After we ended up getting the better equipment, you can definitely hear a difference. And this is a view of our studio. This is what it looks like. And to be frank, it is a closet. It was a closet, a former closet. We took everything out, and now it's our studio. And you can see here we have our mixing board and the computer in the corner there, and we can accommodate up to 4 people on the setup. You can see me sitting there in front of the board. This board here is the Rodecaster Pro, which is a little expensive, I'll admit, but it's really well worth the price. It'll run you about $600. But if you look closely there, you can see that it has, all the faders. It's got a sound bank. So if we're doing a movie chat, we want to play a scene, I can preload it in there and hit the button, and it's in the mix. It comes out, and I can control the volume with the faders. Has a built-in headphone amp, so everybody who's on the podcast gets their own set of headphones. They can hear themselves. They can hear me, as well as Bluetooth capability. So if we end up doing a phone interview, it comes straight into the board, no extra equipment needed. And we can also run audio in and out via USB. So if you want to do like a Skype or a Zoom on your computer, that audio will come into the board. You can run it indirectly and out. You can also run it out to the computer as well. So, we don't use this for remote recording, but it is completely portable. You can put an SD card in there, and you record and mix right from the device. So, it really is a fantastic piece of machinery. I have to assume the price is eventually going to go down. It's fairly new, but it's extremely popular. So I have to assume that, the more they sell, I think the more that they'll decide to make different versions of it, and maybe you'll be able to get the Rodecaster Pro 1 for a cheaper price. So we also have those mics there, are Heil PR40 microphones, which are very nice mics, along with the booms and the pop filters. And there's very good audio coming out of this setup. So we're very, very happy and very blessed to have a very supportive administration to allow us to get this equipment. So another new example is centered on business. Specifically from the Miller Business Center. It's our new project. It's an every other week project. So every other week we do a podcast, and I'd say it's more long form. So we do go over the 25, 30 minutes on these, and they're more structured than our other show. It focuses on the interests and concerns of small businesses on Long Island, with an added emphasis on how the Miller Business Center can support those small businesses. So right there, this is a great example for you. Right there, this is a podcast that we are being informative. We are not selling anything on the podcast, but we are telling people, hey, listen, did you like what you heard? We can help you build your business if you come into the library. So we had huge plans for this podcast. We had already lined up a few interviews. We had just interviewed a gentleman for one of Elizabeth's ideas, and it's a great concept. I don't want to tell you because I want it to be a surprise, but I can't wait for you to hear it. But then all this pandemic stuff went down, and now we're all at home. So, we didn't want to not do it, or else we might get stuck not pursuing it this year with everything else. We all get busy at the library. So we decided, we're home. It might not be exactly what we want, but the show must go on. So we have a slightly different format right now. It's not exactly what we wanted, but it's been pretty fabulous, to be honest. The 3 episodes that we have out there, more are coming as of this presentation. So we're just getting started with this podcast. And of course, we need to record this remotely, so we're using Squadcast, which I mentioned before. So each of us at home has the Squadcast website loaded I send a link out to Elizabeth and Alex, and that's how we record the show. We plan the shows in advance. Usually 2 weeks in advance, we'll plan the show. We'll record it about a week before it goes up, so I have time to edit. Is it perfect? No, but you know what? Everyone is doing it this way right now, and it is working out. The sound quality is not 100% great. Again, it's not what we wanted, but content is king, and the content and the subject is more important right now than it sounding like a professional, high-end podcast. So by all means, if you have something to say and you have an iPhone or an Android device, use the voice memo, get some free software, go out there and start your own podcast. Now is the time that we're all home. So you want to use your podcast as a means of educating and entertaining your listeners. There it is again. While at the same time marketing your business. So I want to give you a couple examples of companies that are doing that. And we're going to keep this fairly simple in the examples here. So there's a company called Unbundled Attorney, and they have a podcast called The Mastermind Podcast. And this was a company that came to Podfest last year to discuss their podcast. They are a company that works with lawyers to hook them up with clients and to connect their clients with lawyers. So they're kind of doing things on both sides. They have consumers coming in to get legal services, and then they're dealing with lawyers who come in who use their service to find more clients for their practices. So it's kind of like an Instacart Uber concept where, all these outside law firms can come in and use the service. And then if someone's looking for a specific type of law, then this company will help connect the outside firm with the consumer looking for that business. So they're creating a network of lawyers and being the middle person. And that's, for a lack of a better term, they're like brokers. So this is what their site looks like, and you can see they have a YouTube feed, and they also record their audio. So in this case, how lawyers can retain a high number of new paying clients during an economic downturn. So lawyers come to the site, they get information, they listen to and subscribe to the podcast, and then there's a link here. For more information about Unbundled Attorney and how our exclusive unbundled leads can help grow your practice, visit this website. So this is at the very end of the podcast notes. You can see they have links there and whatnot. So this is one example. You have a company who's selling a service to other lawyers. They have a podcast that lawyers might like. So the lawyers come, they listen to the podcast, and then at the end, there's a little pitch. The pitch happens just at the end. Okay, so this doesn't have to be a huge, gigantic sales push here. This could be a nice informational podcast about what lawyers are looking for, and then at the end, there's the marketing of the business. This is the simplest way of doing it. But here's another example. So this is a company called Dreams Unlimited Travel. This is a company that I love and listen to their podcast every week. So I'm a Disney fan, a huge Disney fan, and they are a Disney-centric podcast. And they're also specifically Disney and Universal Resort-focused travel agents. So their whole business, and it's unfortunately during this time when things are closed, but their whole business are Disney vacations and cruises and vacations to the West Coast and vacations to Disney and Hawaii and all that kind of stuff. So they have a podcast. They have multiple podcasts, actually, but their main podcast is once a week. And folks come and listen to them talk about Disney. And it's not a sales pitch. It's people talking about Disney news, about what's new rides, new food. At this point, they're talking about, what during a pandemic and Disney is closed, what can people do to pass the time? And listen, even though I'm super familiar with making my own reservations, I've been to Disney, once, twice, 3 times a year for the last, 15, 20 years. I can make my own plans, no problem. I don't need a travel agent to help me out with that kind of stuff. But because I'm a fan and because I wanted to support them, this year when the time came to book my trip, I used one of the podcast agents to make my reservations. Now, look, I don't know if I'm going this year in the end. It's later in the year. I don't know if I'm going to be able to go, but it's just, to me, I wanted to support them. It's a great example of a podcast connecting me to their services and their business. They talk about Disney. I like listening to their opinions on Disney. And at the same time, I can contact them and get pricing and book with them for my Disney vacation. My agent, who I deal with, is on this podcast regularly. I like him on the show. I connect with him and his opinions on Disney, so I gave him my business. And it's that simple. Now, here's some other podcasts that you might be interested in. These are all business-based, and some of these I've had the pleasure of seeing speak at Podfest, specifically John Lee Dumas, which is JLD Interviews Entrepreneurs on Fire, and Pat Flynn, who is a fantastic speaker, and he's got a great podcast. And some of these are also Elizabeth's favorites as well, and she's a big podcast listener here at the library. So, you have long-form business podcasts like Business Wars, which is a great podcast. They do like long multi-episodes on like Airbus versus Boeing, one type of company versus the competitor. And then they do short form, which is like a couple of minutes a day, and that's the Business Wars Daily. So they have two different flavors of their podcast. So there's a lot out there, and this is a great way for you to see what other people are doing. So, take a listen and get some ideas. And you should do a search for Long Island local podcasts and local businesses. And you know what? I need to do a little shameless plug here. This is just a shout out to some of friends of our library podcasts, the Library Pros, the Long Island History Project, and the LI Law Podcast. If you want to hear what some local folks, really local folks in our community are doing, they're all great. So do a search for these podcasts and check them out. Again, a little plug for our friends right there. And thank you so much. So marketing your podcast and business, you want to build your audience via social networking, word of mouth, interviewing, just, when we can get all back together again, face-to-face networking, and your website. So if you market your podcast, you're marketing your business as well. Interview partners or folks in your community to get the word out about your business. We see, again, I mentioned this before, we see our biggest download numbers when we have someone on the show. And if your business has some connection to the community, have a community leader come on as an interview. You're going to see big increases. We had one of our local town politicians come on to talk about a big event that was going on in our community, and our episode count, the downloads just blew it out. It's our highest downloaded episode ever. So social networking is great. Facebook, Twitter. What's great about using a podcast to market your business and also having like a podcast host is that they'll give you a link to your podcast, and you can post it right in Facebook, and people can listen to it right in Facebook or right on Twitter. So that's a great thing. It's just all very important that, you market your business through your podcast and you market your podcast through your business. So here's some ideas for you and some of the things that we did for the library podcast. Flyers, bookmark. The bookmark especially is great because, we have folks who come in to take take books out and we put these postcards inside the books randomly. So they'll go home, they'll open the book up, and there'll be a bookmark in there. So they have a nice bookmark, and they have an advertisement for our podcast. And we also did business cards specifically for the podcast. So when we go to Podfest, we hand those out. It's got all our names on them. And then here you could see episode 55, MCPL Podcast Movie Chat. That was a Facebook post. So you create the posts to get the word out that your podcast is available for download. Now, you also need to connect with your audience, and that's going to lead to building your business and client relationships. Ask your listeners for feedback. Ask them for ideas for future shows. They're basically telling you what they want from you and perhaps what they want from your business. Ask them, hey, if you like the show, give us a 5-star rating, or, comment below, tell a friend, subscribe, turn your notifications on. Make sure you interact. If you're posting on social networks and a customer reaches out to you about the show, respond back. Maybe have them on your show. Do you have, are they a success story? Interview them for your podcast, a little 2-minute interview. Say, listen, can I interview about our services? And they are your own advertisers right there. Your good customers are your own advertisers. So this is a great way for you to build your audience by connecting with your audience. Use your podcast and your personality to drive traffic to your website, your storefront, and your events. Like I said before, personality comes out very well on a podcast. You definitely don't want to just sit there and read from a script. Bring your personality, because it's you. You're a small business owner. Your heart, your soul is in your business. Bring that out on your podcast. Let people hear that, and they will connect to you, and they might be more willing to connect with you money-wise and business-wise because they feel like they know you. They feel like they have a relationship with you even before they step into your store or even before they give you a call to get your product or service. And finally, your podcast alone will not help build your business. It should be used as another component to your marketing plan. It is just one part of that big, huge plan that is a powerful tool for building your business. So, look, this is the end of the presentation. I've only just scratched the surface. If you want to talk to me more about this, or if you have a question about starting a podcast, or perhaps you thought this was fantastic and you want to be on our show and tell us how great we were and we'll interview you, send us an email, millercenter@mcplibrary.org. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.